Hi, I'm Chris. This is Finding God at Work. Our current series is Gentle Witnesses, sharing the good news at work in a way that actually makes sense. Before we get started today, I wanted to share a fun announcement. In case you missed it, in our last episode, I shared that we have now launched the online course version of Finding God at Work. So it's not just a podcast, it's also a course. You can go to findinggodatwork.org to check it out. It's video-based, it's self-paced. There's 50 micro lessons divided into 6 chapters, and so you can do it whenever you want. And the normal cost is $75, but if you're a podcast listener, which you are if you're hearing this, you can use the discount code POD30 for 30% off. That's POD 30. So just head to findinggodatwork.org if that sounds intriguing and maybe something that would be helpful for you. Here's today's episode. I want to take some time in this episode to just get down to brass tacks about sharing the good news in the workplace and some of the snags that might come up in that process. So my context is going to be the United States and what it's like to be a committed Christian in a secular workplace in the United States. There's lots of other contexts that are relevant for disciples of Jesus around the world, obviously, but that's what I know, and I figured that many listeners might benefit from just thinking through some of these things practically. So first we want to talk about the law, then we want to talk about power dynamics, and finally, we want to go to the story of Daniel just for some encouragement. Okay, so first of all, the law. I was at a conference in the summer of 2024 with a Christian business leader, and he was talking about his own experience of discovering praying with fellow Christians in the workplace. And he said at first he didn't want to do that because he thought it was illegal. So it's just helpful to clarify some of the basic things, like it's not illegal to pray in the workplace. It's not illegal to share the good news with other people in the workplace. It just depends on how you do it, right? So the legal ramifications here actually come from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, which says that non-work related topics are okay to discuss at work, including religious topics, as long as it's voluntary. So you can't force somebody to have a religious conversation at work, like if you're in a position of authority. And also, if somebody doesn't want to have a religious conversation and you insist on continuing to talk to them about religious things, that could be interpreted fairly as a form of harassment. So it might be weird to go to the point of law, but it's just a helpful clarity. Sometimes people get confused about this. And I hope it goes without saying that if you approach evangelism in the way that I've encouraged it throughout this series, where you start with listening, it's all about building trust. It's about giving as much as people are open to receiving in a given moment, that you're not going to get anywhere near what could be considered harassment. The kind of thing that is really prohibited legally falls more into the category of proselytism. That's the kind of forced, pushy version of evangelism, which I don't think is a healthy version anyways. And so we really, if we're approaching this in an emotionally intelligent way, in order to come alongside our friends and help them discern their next steps, in as much as they're open to that sort of thing, we're going to be fine. We're not going to run into any sort of legal problems. Now, HR is at a different level than the law, right? So your team may have a different human resources policy than another team or another organization. And so that raises the question, how much do you have a right to do? Like, can your boss actually prohibit these sorts of conversations? And the answer again is no. The boss, the authorities that be HR, they're not allowed to prohibit voluntary, non-work related conversations. Now, that doesn't mean they have to support or champion those conversations either. But that question is going to depend on the specific company. Whether your particular corporation and your HR team is going to promote faith conversations or merely tolerate faith conversations, that's up to them. But in terms of just like informal conversations with friends, with coworkers, that's all fair game as long as it's voluntary, as long as it's not forced, as long as you're honoring what the other person's genuinely open to or not. So that requires self-awareness, right? Like you have to be able to tell if the other person really doesn't want to talk about this stuff. Like you got to be able to tell. So if you're like, man, I don't think anybody has ever disliked having a religious conversation with me, there's 2 possibilities. One is that you're really, really great at respecting people's boundaries and intuiting what they are, and that's why no one has ever had a problem. The other is that you're just totally emotionally tone deaf and you have no idea what people's boundaries are. So talk to like a trusted friend and be like, hey, like I can't remember a time when somebody like was bothered. Do you think that's because I'm really sensitive or because I'm not sensitive at all? And hopefully if you have a good friend, they can be a mirror for you and help you discern if you're doing great or if you need to maybe grow in some emotional intelligence in how you have faith conversations. Again, if we approach this in a way that's healthy, if we approach this in a way that's inspired by the way that Jesus himself proclaimed the good news, using the gentleness of Jesus, caring about people, we're probably not going to run into too many issues. Now, that being said, there are workplaces that are more antagonistic. And sometimes, despite what the law says, there will even be workplaces that try to prohibit even voluntary spiritual conversations. They're more anti-faith. I believe that's the exception rather than the rule in the United States, but it does crop up every once in a while. Now, when that happens, sometimes Christians may be apt to use the word persecution, like, oh, I'm being persecuted for my faith. Again, sometimes I feel like people use that term when they don't realize that they're just being jerks and emotionally tone deaf, and they're not being persecuted for their faith. They're just getting bad reactions to the fact that they're not sensitive about other people's emotions and openness or lack thereof. But it is possible to face some measure of resistance. But even when we face some measure of resistance in certain workplaces in the United States, I really don't think that the word persecution is appropriate to use. Here's why. There's this wonderful scholar named Knox Thames, and his name is spelled like the River Thames, but it's pronounced Thames. And he wrote a book called Ending Persecution. So he's kind of one of the global experts about religious persecution. And he has this to say. This is from an article he wrote a few years ago. I hope Americans will set the term persecution aside so it doesn't lose its intensity or veracity. The United States is one of the most open and liberal countries for freedom of religion and belief. Persecution is the imprisoning of Christians because they are Christians. Persecution is the sudden closing or commando-like police raids upon your church. Persecution is bulldozing churches to the ground. Persecution is the murder of Christians for their faith. And he cites all of those examples of persecution because all of those examples have happened around the world and around the globe. There is real persecution, actual violence committed against Christians, state actors putting people in prison because they are Christians. That's persecution, and we need to be in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the Lord in praying for them as they face real persecution. Us having like a relatively hostile HR person is not in the same category. It's just not. Now, it still matters. It could still make it hard for us to do what we want to do, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Like, what do we do when we face challenges, when we face resistance? Okay, so that's kind of like the law and the HR side, just helpful context, helpful things to think about as we go about these conversations. Second thing, power dynamics. Sometimes people have asked me, hey, I'm a manager. I don't want to create a weird dynamic for people who report to me that where they might feel pressured because I'm their boss to say yes to having spiritual conversations. I read a Washington Post article where somebody wrote a letter to an advice columnist saying, hey, I go to these meetings and my boss is always quoting this Christian podcast and I'm not a Christian and it makes me uncomfortable. So when you're in a position of authority, I think we have to be sensitive to power dynamics. Again, this brings us back to what's our approach? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to sell? Are we trying to pressure? Are we trying to impose? No, we're attending to people's souls. We are presenting the good news of Jesus. We are having an attitude of inviting people into the kingdom. And so we don't want to in any way put our thumb on the scale of how other people are responding to us because of our authority. So the first thing is to not do that intentionally, to not abuse your authority by forcing people to do things they don't want to do. So if you're in a secular workplace and you are a manager and you have an opportunity at like a more formal meeting where you're the one gathering the meeting, you're the manager, I would caution you about how you speak about your faith, right? Don't just run roughshod and say, oh, I'm gonna quote from the Bible at every single meeting. You want to create space so that everybody there feels comfortable and doesn't feel like they're being forced to do something religious that they're not comfortable with. Again, your goal is to meet people where they're at, and that includes meeting whoever the least religious or least open to faith member of your team is at. So you want to keep that in mind for anything formal that you're doing. Now, when it comes to more informal conversations, I believe it is possible to have meaningful spiritual conversations across a power differential. It's possible for a boss to have a meaningful spiritual conversation with a subordinate, for lack of a better word, that's a formal word for someone who reports to them, and vice versa. And I know this from having conversations with bosses in my past. Like you can manage up a little bit more freely in the power dynamic than downward. So I think it is possible, but you just have to be really careful. Walk lightly, use discernment, use more caution when there's a power differential, especially if you're the one with more power than the other person than you otherwise would. I find that the most free context for having faith conversations in the workplace, if your workplace is large enough for this, is with a peer who is not on your direct team. So if you have like a lunchroom or some sort of meeting space where you get to know people who are at a peer level to you, it's not like you're several rungs above them on the org chart, but you're not even on their direct team. Those are the freest relationships because you don't even have like the fact that you always have to get work done together and you have each other's, flaws and weaknesses as frustrations in your daily work life. Obviously, you can build peer relationships on your team, but I've just found those are the freest. That's the easiest. Those raise the least amount of questions or concerns in terms of power differentials. Again, that depends on whether your organization is even large enough to accommodate relationships like that existing across departments. So it's not saying don't ever build a relationship or build a faith conversation context across power differentials, but just be more careful. Tread lightly. Make sure that everybody is feeling okay. Don't force anything, and make sure everybody always has an out and that they have the freedom to communicate what they're open to or not. Okay, third thing, just some encouragement from the book of Daniel. So we are not the first people to sometimes have secular employers. This happened to Joseph in the book of Genesis. This happened to Esther in the book of Esther. This happened to Daniel in the book of Daniel. All of these people were employed in empires that did not worship the God of Israel. And we see faithfulness in their ministry. And so I'm reading from Daniel chapter 6. This is the famous passage where he ends up with the lions. But he's got some skeptics, some people that aren't so into him and who want to take him down a notch, down a peg. And so verse 5, finally these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So Daniel was ministering in a pagan court and probably not always talking about the God of Israel in that context, probably honoring the traditions of that context in some way. And yet his competence was such that they knew they wouldn't be able to trip him up about anything unless somehow they got him to violate his own particular faith convictions. So I raise this as an example that I think this is what we ought to aspire to. People should know our faith convictions. That should be an obvious thing about us. Not because we're talking about it all the time, but because we are so true to it. And we shouldn't give people reason to be upset with us or having problems with us in the workplace by simply not being good at our jobs. Our witness will be compromised if we're not doing a good job at our jobs. And we've talked in other series about how our job itself is part of God's mission in the world. And so doing our job well is part of loving God and loving other people. That's something that really comes through when the question of witness, of sharing the good news, comes up. If you have a character that's been demonstrated time and again, such that people cannot find a flaw to criticize in your work, other than maybe the fact that you're a really committed Christian, that means you're doing things right. That means you're staying close to how Jesus would do your job if he had it. But then the question does come up, what if there is resistance to us living out our convictions? How do we respond to that resistance? Now, we know how Daniel responded. He was true to his own convictions. He faced consequences. He was thrown into the lion's den, and then God protected him. And then that gave him an opportunity to proclaim the goodness of God. So after he survives his night with the lion's den, the king calls out to him, and this is verse 21. Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Again, we see that combination, right? Daniel's like, well, this miracle just happened. I think I should talk about God now, right? He talks about how God delivered him, but then he also is like, and I haven't given any other reason for offense, right? I've never done any wrong before your majesty. He's still kind of presenting his credentials as a good worker, a good member of the Empire team, which is really astounding that he was able to be a good member of the Empire team, given all the problems with that empire. So I think similarly, when we face resistance, that is actually an opportunity for us to appropriately speak about our faith while also continuing to show our credentials as good team members. So we shouldn't have a self-righteous attitude or get in a huff or be like, oh, I'm being persecuted because some HR person is not a big fan of us getting a conference room for a Bible study or whatever. Instead, we can use that conversation with the HR person to say like, hey, this matters to me because it's my faith. Jesus really matters to me. That's part of who I am. That's part of why I have this job, is I believe this job is part of God's mission in the world. And, I'm doing this job as well as I know how to do it. I'm being a team player. I just feel like this conference room thing could help other people have a space to talk about what really matters to them too, right? So you can do what Daniel did. You can both speak of your faith when you face resistance, and you can just be true to being a good team player, being good at your job, following the company patterns that you can follow without violating your convictions. That's the right posture to bring to these kind of conversations. Now, that doesn't mean you're always going to win. Daniel had a big slam dunk with a miracle. That's great. Sometimes HR is going to be like, sorry, no dice, no conference room for you. What can you do? You tried. You don't need to start a campaign. You just need to be sensitive. Okay, where's the open opportunity now? If it's not using that conference room for a Bible study, maybe it's something else. So I have examples of this where I've kind of taken a shot at being evangelistic in the workplace and gotten shot down. So I was at one employer, and when we had holiday responders on, like around Christmas time, I was like, Christmas time, people wonder about Christmas. How about I just put a link to the meaning of Christmas in my email responder? So that was my little evangelistic thing I did when I was going to be out of town in December. I think it was a link to the Alpha USA website. Hey, if you're interested in the meaning of Christmas, here's a resource from Alpha USA. Another one of those great organizations that kind of helps give us resources for having these kind of conversations. And that was at a secular employer. There were a lot of Christians involved. The CEO was a Christian, so that probably helped. And I didn't get in trouble for that at all. That was great. People seemed to think it was great. I was at another employer, and I did the exact same thing, and I got shut down by HR. They said, hey, this is a formal communication. You're representing the organization in this communication, so don't do that. It's not the same as an informal lunch place conversation. And I said, okay, that's fine. I wanted to be a good team player. I didn't do it again. I didn't violate that company norm. But I at least found out where the limit was, right? I found out, okay, I have a lot of freedom. I'm allowed to do certain things here, but I can't put on an evangelistic vacation responder. Now, depending on your personality, you might be thinking oh my gosh, I would never put on an evangelistic vacation responder at a secular workplace. That's just absurd. Why would you even try that? Or on the flip side, you might be like, oh, I'm so offended that they shut you down and that they wouldn't let you use your vacation responder. Again, I want to push back against both of those extremes, right? We should have the humility that we can accept the limits that are imposed on us, generally speaking, unless they truly violate our convictions. Saying that we can't share in a certain way using an official communication channel is not the same as asking us to violate our convictions. While at the same time, I think we should be bold. We should have gentle confidence and try and find out where those limits are. Find out to what extent we can, with confidence, with openness, talk about our convictions, talk about the good news with others, again, in a way that's sensitive to them and their level of openness. So that's just my 2 cents on some practical things about sharing your faith in the workplace. Would love to hear from you too about your thoughts. You can reach out via our website like normal if you have interesting perspectives on what it means to share the good news in your work context. Let me just close, as usual, with a prayer to our Lord, asking to be with us as we attempt to do this in His name. Lord Jesus, thank you that you have good news, that you did die, that you did rise again, that you are changing our lives. Give us your gentle confidence to share that news in our workplaces in a way that makes sense. Give each of us wisdom and discernment and humility and confidence for our context to do that well and to do it in your name and in your character. Jesus, do your work in us as we do our work with you. Amen.
Thanks for listening. Finding God at Work is a production of Mission Central, a ministry based in Aurora, Illinois, dedicated to forming Christians for mission in everyday life. You can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to this episode to get 10 minutes of teaching on faith and work every Tuesday and Thursday. To get resources to go deeper with each podcast series, read our blog, and get info about upcoming courses on faith in the workplace, go to our website, missioncentral.church.